For decades, the KGB built its reputation on paranoia, not as a flaw, but as a core operating principle that shaped every layer of Soviet counterintelligence. Foreign diplomats were followed relentlessly, hotel rooms were monitored with obsessive precision, and every Western visitor was treated as a potential intelligence threat from the moment they arrived in Moscow. Surveillance was not merely a tactic for the Soviet security apparatus, it was a worldview. It was rooted in the belief that danger always came from outside the system, carried by people who looked foreign, sounded foreign, and behaved in ways that did not fully belong. What the KGB failed to grasp was something far more subtle, that the most dangerous threat is often the one that does not resemble a threat at all. While enormous resources were devoted to tracking embassies, intercepting communications, and shadowing suspected agents across the city, the system developed a blind spot that went largely unnoticed. It was so complete that it never appeared in official doctrine or operational planning. Soviet counterintelligence assumed that private spaces, especially the homes of senior officials, were inherently secure. These places were believed to be protected not only by physical barriers, but by unquestioned loyalty and rigid internal control. That assumption would remain unchallenged for 14 years, quietly shaping how Soviet counterintelligence viewed its own security. By the late 1960s, the Soviet Union stood at the height of its power, and Moscow was a city governed by rigid hierarchies and unspoken rules. Senior officials lived behind high walls in exclusive neighborhoods, surrounded by symbols of authority and reinforced by the belief that control extended fully into their private lives. Within these households existed a class of people who were essential, yet largely invisible. Gardeners, drivers, cooks, and domestic workers moved through these spaces every day, maintaining the routines that allowed elite life to function, yet they rarely registered as individuals worthy of attention. To the KGB, this invisibility was not a vulnerability, it was simply part of how power worked. At the same time, across the Atlantic, American intelligence was facing a growing crisis. By the mid-1960s, traditional espionage methods inside the Soviet Union were producing steadily diminishing returns. Diplomatic covers were compromised almost immediately, and known intelligence officers were followed with relentless consistency. The CIA understood that the Soviet counterintelligence system had become highly effective at detecting anything that fit its expectations. The problem was no longer how to hide better, but how to exist in a way that did not trigger suspicion at all. The solution did not come from new technology or more elaborate tradecraft. It emerged from an uncomfortable realization about human behavior and the nature of power.
Power, especially absolute power, creates blind spots. Those blind spots tend to form around people who are perceived as insignificant. Soviet officials expected threats to come from trained professionals attempting to penetrate the system from the outside. They did not seriously consider the possibility that someone could enter their world by becoming part of the lowest, most overlooked layer within it. The idea was simple in concept, but extreme in execution. Instead of observing the Soviet leadership from a distance, an American operative would live inside their private space. He would not arrive as a guest or a diplomat, but as someone whose presence would never be questioned because it seemed entirely natural. He would not appear as a spy in disguise, or as a man carrying secrets in his pockets. He would be a worker who spoke little, labored daily, and belonged exactly where he was. A gardener, a role so ordinary that it blended seamlessly into the background of elite Soviet life. In Soviet culture, gardens were considered safe spaces where caution faded and conversations loosened. Officials spoke freely on terraces and among flower beds, believing that walls, distance, and familiarity provided natural security. They assumed that no one listening could possibly matter. That assumption was catastrophically wrong. In the spring of 1967, a man stepped off a train at Moscow's Kazansky station, carrying a worn leather suitcase and documents identifying him as Ivan Petrov, an agricultural worker from Belarus. He did not draw attention, and nothing about him suggested he was worth following. To Soviet security, he was simply another face in the crowd.
What the KGB officers conducting routine surveillance did not know was that this unremarkable man would spend the next 14 years living inside the home of one of their most senior officials. Every morning he would tend roses, prune trees, and sweep paths, while quietly gathering intelligence without ever touching a document. This was not an operation built on speed, daring, or dramatic confrontation. It was built on patience, discipline, and the willingness to disappear completely into a role so ordinary that it became invisible. And it succeeded not because the KGB failed to look hard enough. It succeeded because they never thought to look there at all. Becoming invisible was not a matter of disguise. It was a matter of transformation. For the operation to work, the man who would live inside the KGB chief's household could not merely pretend to be Soviet. He had to think, react, and exist as someone shaped entirely by life inside the system. Any trace of performance, any hint of imitation, would eventually surface under the weight of daily routine. That man was Thomas Whitmore. Whitmore was 34 years old when he was selected for the operation that would later be known inside the CIA as Green Thumb.
He had grown up in rural Oregon, raised on a working farm where physical labor was routine and patience was learned early. Gardening was not a cover skill for him. It was something he genuinely understood, something his hands knew instinctively. More importantly, Whitmore had already proven that he could disappear in plain sight. For 5 years he had worked undercover in East Berlin, operating without incident, drawing no attention, and showing an unusual ability to suppress emotion under pressure. Psychological evaluations described him as methodical, disciplined, and remarkably comfortable with isolation. Those traits mattered more than courage. The CIA was not looking for someone who could improvise or take bold risks. They needed someone who could endure monotony, who could live the same day repeatedly without slipping, and who could accept that success would bring no recognition, no feedback, and no visible result. Whitmore was told from the beginning that extraction might never come. The preparation took 18 months and was designed to erase Thomas Whitmore piece by piece. He was sent to a secluded CIA facility in rural Pennsylvania, where defectors from the Soviet Union had helped recreate the physical and psychological environment he would face in Moscow. There was a Soviet-style apartment, a small garden plot, and instructors who corrected not just his language, but his posture, gestures, and habits. He learned how Soviet workers complained about shortages, how they queued without visible frustration, and how they spoke cautiously, even in casual conversation. He studied Marxist-Leninist theory, not to debate it, but to survive routine political discussions without attracting attention. He learned when to speak, when to remain silent, and how to express mild agreement without enthusiasm. Even the smallest details mattered. He practiced drinking tea from a glass held in a metal podstakonik, learned how to fold Soviet newspapers correctly, and memorized the rhythm of provincial speech patterns from Belarus. His accent was adjusted until it sounded neither educated nor crude, but comfortably unremarkable. The goal was not to be convincing under scrutiny. The goal was to never invite scrutiny at all. The cover identity was constructed with the same precision. Ivan Petrov was not a man with an interesting past. He was deliberately mundane, a former collective farm worker from Belarus, widowed, with no children, no military service, and no advanced education. His village had been consolidated into a larger collective, leaving him unemployed and directionless. Coming to Moscow for work was not ambitious. It was expected. His documents were genuine Soviet papers, acquired through networks the CIA had spent years cultivating. His employment history inside Moscow would become real before he ever approached his target.
For 2 months, Whitmore lived in a communal apartment, took odd jobs, repaired fences, cleaned courtyards, and helped elderly residents with their garden plots. He stood in bread lines, attended neighborhood meetings, and learned the unspoken rules of communal living. By the time anyone checked his background, there would be something to find. Ivan Petrov existed. By June of 1967, Whitmore had become invisible, even to himself. The routines no longer felt practiced, they felt natural. When the opportunity finally appeared, it did not feel like the start of an operation. It felt like another job offer in a city full of them. Colonel Dmitry Volov's regular gardener had suffered a heart attack, and his wife, Svetlana, was frustrated by the neglect of their estate. Through informal domestic worker networks, Ivan Petrov's name surfaced as someone reliable and skilled. The interview was conducted not by security officers, but by Svetlana herself. She asked practical questions about fruit trees, soil conditions, and pruning schedules. Whitmore did not perform or exaggerate. He answered calmly, offering specific observations about the property that demonstrated genuine expertise. 3 days later, he was hired. The KGB vetting process focused on political reliability rather than imagination. His documents were checked and passed scrutiny because they were real. His residence history was verified and appeared ordinary. His behavior aligned perfectly with expectations. The possibility that an American intelligence officer would willingly spend years doing physical labor as a gardener never entered their calculations. In July of 1967, Ivan Petrov moved into a small cottage on the Volov estate, and the operation quietly began. The intelligence work did not begin with secrets or documents. It began with routine. For the first months on the estate, Ivan Petrov did nothing except work. He rose before dawn, tended the neglected gardens with quiet precision, repaired the greenhouse, and restored the grounds to a condition that pleased the household. The work was real, demanding, and unrelenting, and that was precisely what made the cover credible. If the garden failed, the operation failed. Colonel Volov and his wife observed the transformation with approval, not because they were impressed, but because they were satisfied. Satisfaction breeds complacency, and complacency creates space. Within weeks, the gardener became part of the background, a familiar presence whose movements no longer required attention. That was when the intelligence began to flow. The Volov residence had a terrace overlooking the gardens, and during warmer months, the French doors to the study were often left open. As Ivan worked below, pruning bushes or raking leaves, fragments of conversation drifted down without caution. He did not stop moving, did not react, and never looked up. His hands stayed busy. His attention did not.
At first, the information was basic. He noted who visited the house, the frequency of gatherings, and the rhythm of the household. Names and faces emerged gradually, matching profiles he had memorized years earlier during training. Over time, patterns formed, and patterns were intelligence. Once every 3 weeks, on his scheduled day off, Ivan traveled into central Moscow. He followed the same routes, visited the same shops, and attended services at the same Orthodox church. There, under the appearance of routine devotion, he left brief notes written in coded agricultural language, concealed where he had been instructed. The communication was one way. He received no guidance, no confirmation, and no reassurance that his reports were even being read. That silence was intentional, forcing him to operate without reassurance or confirmation. The most valuable intelligence came not from formal meetings, but from moments when people forgot that anyone else was present. Soviet officials spoke differently in private spaces, and even more freely when surrounded by people they considered irrelevant. Ivan became invisible furniture. In October of 1967, he overheard his first conversation of real consequence. Volov was hosting colleagues for lunch on the terrace, and the discussion turned casually to an operation in Western Europe. A name surfaced repeatedly, mentioned with quiet satisfaction, accompanied by references to access and influence. Ivan recorded the name carefully, without knowing its significance. Years later, when that individual was exposed as a Soviet agent embedded near the West German chancellor, American analysts traced their earliest warning back to a gardener working beneath an open window. The intelligence had not been dramatic in the moment. Its value only became clear with time. This pattern repeated itself. Ivan reported on moods, concerns, and anxieties expressed in passing, often revealing more than official communications ever could. During the Prague Spring of 1968, he overheard conversations that grew increasingly tense, marked by frustration and certainty rather than hesitation. Those shifts told analysts that intervention was coming, weeks before it occurred. As Volov rose within the KGB hierarchy, the quality of the conversations changed. Social gatherings became more frequent, and the garden filled with senior officials who spoke openly while strolling among the paths Ivan maintained. He heard discussions about American intelligence capabilities, about weaknesses and uncertainties, and about fears that Western technology was advancing faster than expected. He listened without reacting, memorizing fragments, and reconstructing them later in the privacy of his cottage. He never touched a document. That limitation was deliberate. Physical espionage left traces, and traces invited investigation. Ivan's value lay precisely in what he did not do.
He was a passive observer, a human sensor embedded so deeply that no one thought to check for him. The discipline required to maintain that restraint was constant. On one occasion, during a household emergency, Ivan found himself briefly alone in Volov's study. The temptation was overwhelming, as files and a safe sat within reach. The potential intelligence value was enormous, but the risk was absolute. He did nothing, understanding that restraint was the only way to keep the operation alive. That decision preserved the operation for years. As time passed, the intelligence accumulated into something far more valuable than isolated facts. Ivan's reports revealed how Soviet leadership thought, how they reacted to uncertainty, and how private concerns differed from public confidence. He provided insight into intentions, not just actions. And all of it came from conversations spoken casually, under the assumption that no one listening mattered. Living invisibly carried a cost that no training could fully prepare him for. By design, Ivan Petrov existed without acknowledgement. He had no colleagues, no confidants, and no meaningful relationships beyond the functional exchanges required by his role. Every interaction was measured, filtered, and shaped by the identity he wore each day. There was no moment when the act could be set aside. At night, after the household had settled and the estate fell quiet, Ivan returned to the small cottage that had once housed the estate's pre-revolutionary gardener. The space was simple, private, and sufficient, but it was also a boundary. Inside it, he was alone with his thoughts in a way that became increasingly difficult to manage. During the day, his mind worked constantly, recording conversations, sorting details, and organizing information into mental categories that could be written down later. At night, that same mind had no task to anchor it. Silence filled the space, and with it came the strain of sustained isolation. He could not speak freely to anyone. Every word he uttered had to reinforce Ivan Petrov. Every reaction had to align with the expectations of a Soviet laborer shaped by loss, routine, and resignation. Any deviation, no matter how small, carried risk. Over time, this vigilance became exhausting. To preserve a sense of self, he developed private rituals. Sometimes, late at night, he would speak English aloud in a whisper, forming words slowly, just to hear the sound of his native language. On other nights, he closed his eyes and reconstructed the landscape of his childhood in Oregon, recalling the smell of pine trees and the feel of soil that belonged to a life that now felt distant. These moments were not indulgences. They were survival. Even so, the boundary between Thomas Whitmore and Ivan Petrov began to erode. He noticed subtle changes in how he thought and reacted. Russian phrases came to mind before English ones.
His instincts aligned increasingly with the habits of the man he pretended to be. This was not a failure of discipline, but the natural consequence of living a single identity without relief. The psychological literature on long-term deep cover operations was limited, but what existed described a phenomenon known as identity diffusion. When a person lived as someone else for too long, the distinction between the authentic self and the constructed persona began to blur. Whitmore felt that blurring firsthand. The work itself offered no reassurance. His reports disappeared into dead drops without response. He had no way of knowing whether the intelligence he gathered was valued, whether it shaped decisions, or whether anyone even remembered he was there. Trust became an act of faith. He trusted that the system functioned, that someone retrieved the notes, and that the silence meant success rather than neglect. That trust was tested repeatedly, especially during periods of heightened tension. In 1970, a counterintelligence failure elsewhere triggered a renewed internal investigation within the KGB. Domestic staff in the homes of senior officials were interviewed, their backgrounds reviewed, and their routines examined. Ivan was questioned twice, calmly and methodically. He answered without hesitation. His cover held because it was grounded in reality. He knew farming in Belarus because he had learned it. His work history existed because he had built it. The only lie was his identity, and that lie was supported by years of consistent behavior. When the investigation concluded, he returned to his routines, outwardly unchanged. Internally, the reminder was sharp and unmistakable. Survival depended not on cleverness, but on absolute consistency. As the years passed, the physical toll became more visible. Gardening a large estate through Moscow's brutal winters and sweltering summers was demanding labor. His hands grew calloused and arthritic. His back ached constantly. Cold weather settled into his joints and never fully left. He could not complain. Seeking medical attention risked exposure, and showing weakness invited scrutiny. So he worked through pain, using physical exhaustion as an anchor when his mental world felt unstable. The estate was beautiful. The gardens flourished under his care. To the Vulov household, Ivan was a reliable fixture, a man who had always been there and always would be. To himself, he felt increasingly suspended between two lives, fully belonging to neither. In this state of quiet erosion, the operation continued, successful by every measurable standard, while the man sustaining it slowly wore down in silence. The operation did not end with an arrest or an interrogation. It ended with a body that could no longer endure the strain. By the early 1980s, Ivan Petrov had lived inside the Vulov household for 14 years.
The work continued as it always had, steady and disciplined, but the margins for error had narrowed. Surveillance capabilities had grown more sophisticated, routines had become more predictable, and the cumulative weight of isolation had taken a visible toll. Ivan felt it before anyone else noticed. His sleep became shallow and irregular, and fatigue settled into his movements, even as he forced himself to maintain the same pace. His hands sometimes trembled in the cold. His chest tightened unexpectedly, a warning he could neither acknowledge nor investigate without risking his cover. In March of 1981, during one of his routine trips into Moscow to make a dead drop, Ivan sensed surveillance. It was subtle, fragmented, and inconclusive, but unmistakable to someone who had lived under constant threat for years. A figure appeared twice along his route. A car lingered where it should not have. Patterns failed to align. He aborted the drop and returned to the estate. For days, he continued his routines exactly as before, working in the gardens, speaking when spoken to, and showing no sign of concern. Internally, he prepared for the possibility of arrest, rehearsing the narrative that might hold under initial questioning. Nothing happened, and that uncertainty was far more exhausting than confirmation. No questions followed. No one came. The surveillance either had nothing to do with him, or it had moved elsewhere. The uncertainty was worse than confirmation. He had no way to signal his handlers, no way to request guidance, and no way to accelerate an end that might never come. Then, in early April, the decision was made for him. While working among the rose bushes he attended for more than a decade, Ivan collapsed. The pain was sudden and overwhelming, the result of a heart attack brought on by years of stress, poor nutrition, limited medical care, and sustained physical labor. He was found by the household staff and taken to a Soviet hospital. For days he drifted in and out of consciousness, aware only that his cover was now fragile. Much of what followed was beyond his control. Hospitals generated records. Doctors asked questions. Backgrounds could be examined. The risk was no longer theoretical. When he regained full awareness, Svetlana Vulov sat beside his bed. She had brought flowers from the estate and spoke with genuine concern about the faithful gardener who had served them so well. The doctors assured her he would recover, but they made one thing clear. He would not be able to return to heavy physical labor for months, perhaps ever. That reality ended the operation more decisively than any investigation could have. Ivan Petrov's value to the household was his labor. Without it, there was no reason for him to remain. Colonel Vulov visited once, thanked him for his years of service, and informed him that a replacement would be found. It was said kindly, and it was final.
Ivan felt an unexpected mixture of relief and fear. The operation was ending, but his cover remained intact. He was not exposed. He was simply a worn-out worker who could no longer do the job. Extraction followed the protocol he had been trained for years earlier, but never expected to use. During his recovery, he requested Orthodox reading materials. Inside a prayer book, he found instructions concealed in a microdoc. The CIA had learned of his hospitalization through its networks and had prepared a plan. When he was discharged in late May of 1981, Ivan Petrov traveled to a designated location in Moscow. Within 48 hours, under a new identity and with carefully forged documents, he crossed into Finland. Thomas Whitmore was back in American hands. The debriefing lasted months. Analysts reconstructed 14 years of observations, filling gaps and contextualizing intelligence that had shaped understanding of Soviet leadership thinking, priorities, and fears. Only then did Whitmore learn the full impact of his work. He learned that his reports had influenced policy decisions, clarified intentions, and provided insight unavailable through any other source. The operation had been considered one of the most successful deep cover efforts of the Cold War. The personal cost, however, had been immense. Returning to American life was not a simple reversal. He had lived too long as Ivan Petrov. Social interactions felt unfamiliar. American culture had changed. He sometimes thought in Russian before English and felt detached from the country he had served. Gardening remained. In later years, Whitmore tended his own small plot in the Pacific Northwest, not as a cover, but as something that had become part of him. The habits he had formed in Moscow never fully faded. The Cold War eventually ended, and the system he had worked to undermine collapsed. Whitmore watched from a distance, carrying a quiet understanding of the moral ambiguity that defined his life's work. He had succeeded without heroics, without recognition, and without being seen. And that, perhaps, was always the point.